literally nearly 100 people that collaborated on this project, and I'm grateful for them and all their assistance as well. So there have been decades of ignoring worker safety issues in poultry and swine processing establishments. You can see that the work is largely the same. On the left-hand side, you see an older picture of someone processing chickens, and then on the right, a more modern picture of people processing chickens. And some jobs have changed quite a bit, others have largely stayed the same. Since 1997, federal regulators have repeatedly revised poultry and swine slaughter inspection systems, increasing authorized line speeds without any formal worker safety requirements, meaning their perspective was that they only really regulated food safety, not worker safety, and they could make changes as long as food was staying safe. Um, that there was a pilot program in 1997 to test new slaughter inspection procedures. And this really shifted responsibilities to establishments. You can see the government rationale was that new establishment responsibilities would promote industry innovation and provide at least the same food safety and consumer protection as other available slaughter inspection systems. And again, there was no worker safety requirements or even evaluation included in this at all. In 2014, there was a new poultry inspection system rule. This is when the USDA FSIS granted 53 evisceration line speed waivers to NPIS establishments. So the current regulation is that the max speed is eviscerating 140 birds per minute. And this allowed these 53 establishments to operate up to 175 birds per minute. And again, there were really no worker safety requirements that were included in this waiver system at all. In 2018, swine followed, and this eliminated the line speed limit of 1106 head per hour to six establishments that were given these evisceration line speed waivers. And again, there was no worker safety requirements included in this change at all. So between 2020 and 2023, there were legal challenges and court orders that led to the study I'm going to talk about today. So in 2020, Public Citizen and UFCW sued the USDA. The lawsuit alleges violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, specifically the failure to adequately consider the impact of evisceration line speed on worker safety. In 2022, the court ordered a worker safety study. So they granted the USDA voluntary remand and mandated that a study to assess the relationship between evisceration line speed and worker safety and health risks needed to occur. In 2023, the lawsuit was dismissed and the waivers were extended, and the USDA extended the line speed waivers to 49 establishments. And the public citizen lawsuit was sort of voluntarily dismissed. And in that period, there was a decision to meet what had been requested of the judge in the court to study the evaluation, study the relationship between the evisceration line speed and worker health. And so we got involved in September of 2022. And we first went and visited a handful of poultry processing sites and swine processing sites to see if, in fact, as the industry was saying, these new systems had essentially not only modernized the processing of chickens and pigs, but had also sort of modernized or mitigated out any risks to the workers. And we didn't find that. When we went and visited these plants, we saw very repetitive work. Granted, the evisceration part was no longer manual, that was automated, but there were certainly jobs upstream of the evisceration point and downstream of the evisceration point, which I'll describe in a moment, that were very manually intensive. So we proposed a study, and in 2023, we started the poultry study, and then in 2024, started the swine study, and had to quickly finish it in January of 2025 when the administration changed. So this was a pretty tight timeline that started again with some site visits that allowed us to put together a study proposal, and we collected quite a bit of data in just, roughly a year or even under a year, and then ended with two large reports, about 150 pages each in January. And then in April of this year, the proposed rule came out, and there was comments that were allowed up until April 20th, 2026. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the study. So some of the key takeaways was that there has been 30 years of increasing line speeds without any formal worker safety standards included or evaluated in that time frame. Legal action was required to compel the USDA to study the worker safety impact from increasing line speeds. There were parallel paths both in poultry and swine processing with similar patterns of regulatory gaps and legal challenges. And so 2023 to 2025 really marked a turning point with these court mandated studies. And then again in 2026, this has led to a proposed rule. So the primary aim of our study, and I'm going to talk about poultry first, and then I'll talk about swine afterwards, but they're pretty similar with just some small differences. And our goal was to really understand the association between evisceration line speed, meaning how fast and how many chickens were getting killed per minute, um, and measures of ergonomic hazard. And these were in 11 different establishments, some of them operating at 140 birds per minute, others operating at 175 birds per minute, and some of them operating sort of in between. We also had this idea that piece rate was really important. And this was from our scoping visits where we went and visited the plants. We realized that evisceration line speed was only part of the equation, and that as more birds got eviscerated and that speed increased, it really depended on how the establishment staffed the lines before and after that evisceration point. And so we felt that piece rate, meaning how many pieces a worker was handling each minute, was really important to capture that relationship between speed of work and the number of, or the amount of work and the number of staff that was doing the same job. So, largely, this is the process for poultry processing. Birds come in and they're alive and they're hung up on shackles. They are then eviscerated, which is again very much an automated process at a speed somewhere between 140 and 175 birds per minute. Those birds, machines essentially take the feathers off and prepare those birds for the cooler. They're in the cooler, they come out, they go to chiller rehang, meaning they get rehung up on shackles. They get usually machine cuts them in half. The bottom half goes to one end of the line and the top half goes to the cone line. There's various processing of the upper half and bottom half of the chicken, and they eventually go to packaging. Now, all the USDA really was regulating was this point here, the evisceration point. And that's what all of the various regulations are based on. And so we had four establishments operating at less than 145 birds per minute, four establishments operating at 175 birds per minute, and then three operating somewhere in between. You can see there were slight differences in the weight of the birds, the average weight of the birds, but not too much. And this was just the average evisceration line speed in those three groups. What's really important to know is that the job-specific line speed, meaning how fast, say, the birds are passing by someone, say, in a particular job, like hanging the birds when they come in alive and they're hanging them on shackles, varies. And so even though this evisceration line speed might be between 140 and 175 birds per minute, we had a live hang speed between 139 and 193 birds per minute. And depending on how many people were in that space managing this number of birds, that would yield some sort of piece rate, meaning the number of birds that someone actually hung, each worker hung, varied between 15 and 39 birds per minute. And then if you look on the other side of the cooler on chiller rehang, that line speed was between 71 and 173 birds per minute. And again, depending on how many staffing was there, that meant that each worker handled between 18 and 50 birds per minute. So there were huge differences in the piece rate, right? How the work pace essentially of individual workers at these different plants. And that was again based on how fast the line speed was in front of that worker and how many people were doing that same job. So our independent variable was evisceration line speed, but it also was worker piece rate. And we did that specifically because we thought that was a better measure of the pace of each worker than evisceration line speed. And worker piece rate is defined as the number of birds hung on shackles by one worker per minute, or the number of birds or pieces of bird that a worker handled per minute. I'm not going to go into too much detail on all of our methodology. I'm going to show you a place that you can go and see some webinars if you're interested in more of the methodology. But I will just say that our primary outcome variable or hazard variable is something called the ACGIH TLV for hand activity. And this is a threshold limit value where we can calculate a score based on things like how much hand force is required for a task, the repetitiveness of the task, and how long, meaning the duration of time, that each hand exertion occurs. Meaning, is someone picking something up and holding it for a while, or are they picking it up and dropping it pretty quickly? And so, based on these three variables, again, the hand exertion force here, and the repetition rate and the duty cycle or the duration of each exertion gives us a score on 0 to 10 called the hand activity level. We can identify how whether or not an individual's exposure is above this solid line. And if it's above this solid line, either from, say, high hand exertion force or high repetition, then we would see that the person exceeds the TLV. And so this threshold is a score of 1.0. If someone has what we call a peak force index TLV above 1, they're in this red zone. And if it's less than 1, then they're in this green or yellow zone. And we use this tool because there are a lot of large studies that have shown that this tool is validated, meaning its score is associated with increased risk of things like carpal tunnel syndrome or hand wrist tendinosis. We gave everybody a survey, and many people got a medical interview as well. We asked things about their demographics like age and sex, and ethnicity and language spoken. We asked about their work history and their shift schedule. We asked about pain that happened more than one day during the prior 12 months, whether they reported that pain, whether they had an injury and reported that injury. We also asked them about their perceptions of line speed, whether they felt it was operating as normal, if it was too fast or too slow. And we also asked them about a break-in period, meaning how long did it take them to be able to do their job without having pain at the end of the day. This project was unique in that we collected a lot of individualized data and we used something called electromyography, which measures the amount of electrical activity or activity in a muscle. And usually we do this in a laboratory. But technology has evolved, and there's this cuff that had recently come out to market, and we did a lot of testing on this cuff and compared it to sort of our laboratory grade equipment and found that it performed very well. And so from this, we can calculate that measure of normalized peak force that I talked about in that graph where there was sort of red, yellow, and green. And so we would put this cuff on people, we'd tape it up, and with a few different steps, we would get something that looked like this, where you can see that someone is simulating a cutting activity. And there's 8 channels in the cuff, and we kept measurements across all 8 channels. We would sum them together, divide them by the person's sort of maximum contraction or maximum strength, and we'd be able to get this sort of relative exertion level for each person. I talked about duty cycle, meaning the duration of each hand exertion and the frequency of each hand exertion, and how these together are used to calculate our 10-point hand activity level score. And we did that using frame by frame analysis on a video. So we took 10 minutes of video for each person, and then we identified a sort of a typical work period. I can't show you the picture here because we're not allowed to, but this will give you an idea of how each video was analyzed multiple times. And the beginning and ending of each hand exertion was identified by a marker like this. And so the duration between the two marks gives us the duration of that hand exertion, how long they actually held something. And then the number of these exertions gives us the frequency. We also use this to identify how fast the line speed was going in front of a particular person. So like how many shackles or cones were crossing by that person per unit of time. And we also evaluate how many staff were there during that time. And then we quantified how many pieces that person was handling. So how many chickens that were hanging or how many pieces of chicken they were handling. And we use that information to, again, give us this hand activity level score down here and this normalized peak force score. So we collected data for 3 days at 11 different establishments, 11 different poultry establishments. We had study teams of about 7 people. We collected survey data on 1,047 individuals. About half of those had a medical interview, and about half of those were videotaped and had EMG, meaning that arm cuff put on them. And so we had about 456 people with that sort of individualized exposure data. And so for our results, the mean age of our folks was 38.4 years of age. Roughly 42% were female. Another 40% roughly were Hispanic. About 50% spoke English as their second language, and roughly the same amount were born outside of the US. Roughly a third had been there for less than a year. Roughly another third had been there between 1 and 5 years. And then just under a third had been there for more than 5 years. 40% of the workers reported experiencing moderate to severe work-related pain. So this is pain over a 4 on that 0 to 10 scale over the past 12 months. And this isn't just like a one-time pain during the day. This had to last, again, more than a day. Among those reporting pain, 25% had difficulty maintaining their work pace. A third considered quitting or changing lines. About a third reported having difficulty performing activities outside of work, like taking care of their children. 20% took paid or unpaid time off work because of their pain or injury, and 40% did not report their pain to a supervisor or nurse. And this was really important because if you look at the injury rates that the industry is reporting, they are claiming that there's no problem, right? They said that before our study. you know, there aren't very many injuries. And if you look at their rates, they are in fact low for musculoskeletal disorders, or they have been going down. But what we found was that there was a serious problem of underreporting, not necessarily, the fact that people weren't getting hurt or didn't have pain. Okay. Um, One of the most important things we found in poultry was that 4 out of 5 workers exceeded the threshold limit value, meaning their work was considered hazardous. And so there were very few people who had a score less than 1. Most had a score greater than 1 and less than 2. And then there was also a considerable amount of group, almost 20%, that had a PFI TLV score greater than 2. So very hazardous work. And you can see that uh, here's the line, that black line that indicates the threshold limit value line. And so anyone above this red line here exceeds that TLV and has hazardous work. Anyone below that line here, has work that is considered safe. And what you can see is that these different colors, purple, green, and open circle, um, are represent those workers that were working at an establishment less than 145 birds per minute, between 145 to 175 birds per minute, or greater than 175 birds per minute. And you can see there's really no difference, right? There's an equal number of people at every single evisceration line speed above and below this line. And then when you look at piece rate, there's a little bit of a difference, right? You see some of these purple dots, or at least the jobs that are below, tend to be more purple, and those are low versus the green who's medium, and then these high ones, there's a higher concentration over beyond that line. And so when we looked at this relationship statistically, you could see there was no difference between line speed and increasing hazard among poultry processing workers. So you can see that these mean scores, 1.4, 1.2, 1.4, there was really no difference at all. But when we looked at piece rate, right, that's a measure of work pace for each individual worker, we saw that the PFI TLV score, the average, was 1.1 for those with low piece rate, 1.2 for those with a medium piece rate, and 1.3 for those with a high piece rate. And that was statistically significant. So we did see a statistically significant difference in the association of piece rate and hazard as a measure of PFI TLV score. So I wanted to talk a little bit about live hang. Again, we see this similar relationship where there's no difference across evisceration line speed establishments and PFI TLV score when we look at live hang. But what's interesting is that with piece rate, we also see this pretty big difference. So this means that at establishments, or sorry, workers with a low piece rate performing the live hang job actually had an average score that was below the TLV of 1. So that was considered non-hazardous. Medium and high piece rates, increasing scores, TLV scores, and both exceeding 1.0. And that was statistically significant. So what we did was we looked at these different evisceration line speed plants, and we said, well, what is causing this difference, right, between the findings of evisceration line speed and piece rate? And what you can see is that the lowest evisceration line speed plants actually had the highest piece rates. So these workers in live hang at these low evisceration line speed plants had the highest piece rate. They were working the hardest. They were handling more chickens per minute than workers at this high evisceration line speed plants, because these high evisceration line speed plants had more staff. And so we use this information to model how many staff would be needed at a particular line speed for live hang to keep workers at this piece rate of 20.2 to make sure that their PFI TLV score was safe, right? Was less than 1. And so we propose this in our report as a way that establishments could easily say, okay, well, if I'm operating at 150 birds per minute in live hang, then I need at least 8 workers because you can't have half of a worker. So you'd have more than 7, but that would be 8 workers. And that would allow them some flexibility to identify how many workers they would need based on the line speed that they had running that day. So, in conclusion, for the poultry processing study, we found that the risk of musculoskeletal disorders or the hazard that we measured was not greater among workers at establishments with higher evisceration line speed compared to lower evisceration line speed. MSD risk was greater among workers who worked at a higher piece rate, which was that job level measure of work pace, compared to those who worked at lower piece rates. Regardless of evisceration line speed, 81% of workers had increased musculoskeletal disorder risk, meaning they had high hazard jobs. And 40% of the workers reported experiencing moderate to severe upper extremity pain in the prior 12 months. So there was a pretty high number of people already experiencing pain. Again, this is the website where the report is provided. You can download it right here. It's lengthy. We wanted to make sure that we were being completely transparent, and so it's about 150 pages. And like I said, there's a lot of material on the COEH website where you can sort of get a more detailed explanation of some of these findings. Okay. Now, the swine study was very similar with one small difference. And so I'm going to go through it a little bit more quickly, and I won't go through the methods because the way that we measured things was the same. In swine, we wanted to look at the association again between line speed, piece rate, and measures of ergonomic hazard in plants that operated at 1106 hogs head per hour and something greater than 1106 head per hour. Now that there were only 6 establishments who had these line speed waivers, and the one that was operating the fastest operated less than 1,450 head per hour. Because there weren't a lot of establishments, and the fact that the establishments were willing to operate at 2 line speeds, we went to fewer establishments, but we went to each one twice. We went one week when the plant was operating at 1106 head per hour. And we went another week when they operated at something faster than 1106 per hour. And then we measured each person, each worker, twice. We measured them at each of these, once when the establishment was operating more slowly, and once when their establishment was operating more quickly. And we were able to compare each person to themselves in this study. It's a little different in swine, meaning there's fewer people who do a lot of these jobs and a lot more jobs. Essentially, the hogs come in on the front end, they get eviscerated, they go to the main chain, they go to something called offal, which takes sort of all the organs and smaller parts out. And then they go to a cooler, they get cut up after the cooler on the cut floor, and they go into packaging. But you can see there are a lot of jobs, 78 jobs in 4 areas. And so in reality, we looked less job by job because we didn't have as many people per job. And we did summarize results by area. And we also, again, just compared each person to themselves when the plant was operating faster versus slower. So, of these 6 establishments, they were all measured at 1106, and then half of them operated between 1106 and 1300, and the other half operated between 1300 and 1450. Each job had a definition of piece rate, and it was something like the number of hogs hung on shackles per minute, or the number of hogs passing by a worker per minute, or the number of hogs cut or hung by a worker per minute. We use the same outcome measure. We use the same approach. We use the wearable devices on the forearm. We used to get our normalized peak force. We used video analysis to get us our hand activity level. And we are looking for scores that were above this threshold limit value line of 1.0 to identify jobs that were hazardous. So we collected data over two separate weeks, as I described before. We had 3 days of data collection per week. That meant we had two measurements per person, and we had a study team of 9 people each week. Um, Obviously, not everyone came back every single week, and so we had 574 people with survey data. We did fewer medical interviews this time around. Um, for a non-TLT speed, meaning that 1106 speed, we had 498 workers. And for the TLT, meaning when establishments were operating faster, we had 519 workers. So because there was a mismatch of people who came both weeks, we ended up having 472 people that had paired data, meaning they had data both the slower week and the faster week. Demographics for this group was a little different than poultry. The average age was similar, 39.6, but only a quarter of workers were female. Nearly 70% were Hispanic. 91.8% spoke English as a second language. 80% were born outside of the US. And you can see that there was a little bit more tenure here, meaning about 20% had worked there more than 10 years, 15% between 5 and 10 years, 40% between 1 and 5 years, and 22% just less than a year. Not as much pain experience in these workers. 20% of workers experience reporting moderate to severe work-related pain. And of these, 19% had difficulty maintaining their expected work pace. 23% considered quitting or changing lines. 35% reported having difficulty performing activities outside of work. 16% took um, paid or unpaid time off work, and 32% did not report their pain to their supervisors or nurse. With that, nearly half, 46%, had a hazardous PFI-TLV score, meaning a score greater than 1. And you can see that some people had scores as high as 3. When we compare the slower weeks to the faster weeks, there wasn't a huge difference, right? There were still people, regardless of whether during the fast weeks their establishments operated less than 1,300 or greater than 1,300. We had roughly half of the people each of the weeks having hazardous scores. And so when we looked at this relationship between evisceration line speed and PFI-TLV scores greater than 1, we really didn't see much of a difference, even in the establishments that had faster line speeds when they were meaning they were over 1,300. And so there was really no statistical significant differences at all. However, we did see a difference in piece rate. And when we looked at differences by establishment, we saw different stories at different establishments. And this is really important, particularly for the proposed ruling that I'm going to talk about shortly. So these are the number of people that had this paired data from each of the 6 establishments during the slower and faster week. In this column, you have the number and percentage of people in each establishment that had a safe, really meaning a less than 1 score in their non-TLT, the slower week. And they still maintained that safer score even when the establishment, sped up. In this column, you see that people were actually had hazardous scores in the slow week. And then the establishment was able to increase staffing when they sped up. And so that those workers actually had better scores when the establishment was operating faster because there were more staffing that had been added. In this scenario, you have people who were had a score less than one, and they moved to a hazardous score. So they were safe. They had a lower hazard in the slow week, and then they had higher hazard in the faster week. And then in this column, you have the number of people who were hazardous at both line speeds. It didn't matter whether their establishments were operating at 1106 or something faster. They had hazardous work. And what you can see is that in establishments B and C, there's a hugely different story. Here in establishment C, about half of the people were had relatively safe jobs before at slower and faster line speeds. About a quarter went from hazardous to non-hazardous scores when their establishment sped up. 8% went from safe to hazardous scores, and only 14% has had hazardous scores at both line speeds. And that's in stark contrast to establishment B, where they had a third that were hazardous, a third that were non-hazardous both weeks, and only 3% went from hazardous to safe jobs, and 27% went from safe jobs to hazardous jobs. And so what we learned from this was that establishments were not necessarily doing the same things when they were speeding up from that 1106 line speed to something faster. They were adding staff in different places. They were adding staff differently, and that was having a big impact on how many or what the hazard levels were and how many people had increased their hazard scores during that faster week. So if we were to look at establishment B and C, and we were to calculate something called a mean median ratio, you can see that anything less than one is good and anything greater than one is not good. And these were statistically significant. And so as establishment C increased their line speed, their hazard scores improved. And as establishment B increased their line speed, their hazard scores worsened. And if you this is based on an increase of 100 hogs per hour. If you scale that out to 200, 300, 400 hogs per hour, you can see that the score, the median ratio, the score goes up pretty substantially for establishment B, and it goes down for establishment C. So what we learned in the swine was that the higher line speeds, evisceration line speed, was associated with a mixed effect on hazard and therefore risk of musculoskeletal disorders. At one establishment, there was a statistically significant increase in hazard and therefore risk of musculoskeletal disorders. In other establishments, there was no statistically significant changes. Some worsened, one got better, but none of them were statistically significant. But at one establishment, there was a statistically significant decrease in risk and hazard. And so that showed us that it can be done, right? There can be an increase in evisceration line speed, and you can do that in a way that is safer for workers, but it's not automatic, right? There was obviously this one plant where hazard clearly increased when they increased their line speed. What we did see is that regardless of evisceration line speed, 46% of workers across establishments were at increased risk of, had increased hazard and increased risk of disorders, and roughly 42% had experienced moderate to severe pain. We published this report at the USDA website. You can find a copy of it. Our overall recommendations were to reduce this TLV score to less than 1 for all swine and poultry processing jobs. We really said that, this is not something new. These recommendations have been made for the last 30 years. And if you look back historically, there have been reports by OSHA, by NIOSH, identifying things that these industries can do to keep workers safe. A lot of those things are not being done. And so the first thing that needs to happen is that they just need to implement best practices that are already out there. The second thing that we noticed was that a lot of people were getting first aid. They'd have some pain or symptoms of injuries. They tell someone about it, and then the company would respond by giving them first aid. And sometimes that first aid was going on for months. Typically, first aid is supposed to be something that is done just like, a little bit for like a few days. And if it doesn't get better, they should go see a doctor. However, these folks were being given Advil, icing, taping, etc., for months at a time and never seen a doctor, which was one reason why the injury rates are so low in the industry. And so the early reporting of MSD symptoms and appropriate care and sending people to doctors to get treated was something that we felt very strongly about. Now, obviously, people had different takes on these reports. The industry came out immediately and said, great, there's no difference between evisceration line speed and hazard. And so they should let us do whatever we want. We shouldn't have to report anything. We should be able to run our operations as fast as we want and however we want. Clearly, worker advocacy groups said, no, wait a minute. This increase in piece rate is a measure of work pace. And you can't just let companies go as fast as they want, because if they don't staff up accordingly, their piece rates will go up and there will be an increase in hazard. Everyone waited patiently until the FSIS, USDA, came out with a proposed rule. And unfortunately, this proposed rule is proposes allowing establishments to determine their own line speeds based on their ability to maintain process control. And they wanted to remove the requirement to monitor or document any work-related conditions of the establishment workers. There was a public comment period, and that public comment period ended on April 20th. And you can see there were 37,381 comments. We submitted a comment along with farmstand.org. And we said that we identified that the proposed rule really fundamentally misunderstood and mischaracterized the scope and results of the pulse study, and that we did find a high baseline level of pain, hazard, and MSD risk. We found a statistically significant association between a measure of work pace and MSD risk, and that the statistically significant increase in evisceration line speed and MSD risk in one establishment, meaning the swine establishment, where there was a clear increase in hazard with increase in evisceration line speed, that couldn't be averaged out just because there was a reduction of hazard at one of the other establishments. And that's really important. I mean, no one would argue that if workers at one plant were highly exposed to radiation, that would be okay as long as there were workers in another plant that were not exposed to radiation. Because if you average those hazards out, overall, it would be an acceptable hazard. And that just doesn't work with hazard. Every worker is important, and hazard of every worker counts. We identified that there was a positive impact of ergonomic programs, but few establishments incorporated them, and that OSHA's oversight does not relieve the FSIS of the need to consider worker safety in these plants, both swine and poultry, particularly when OSHA has failed to address these widespread harms. And so we suggested that the agency needs to require guardrails. They need to make these guardrails mandatory. Otherwise, there'll be no incentive for establishments to implement higher evisceration line speeds safely. And in fact, it actually not only harms workers, but unfairly penalizes companies that invest in the safety of their workers by maintaining those lower piece rates. And so we felt that this study should have been taken as a flashing red light, that is a warning that these industries need to change, and that these increase in evisceration line speeds need again to come with those guardrails. There is a great website that is oxfamamerica.org/lives on the line. And it talks about these workers and tells their stories, and they're really impactful, moving stories. And I feel like every person in this country should watch them to be grateful for what these workers do for us to give us the food that we eat. This website, coeh.berkeley.edu, has a lot of information, both handouts and summaries that we would love to get out to workers, as well as some other webinars that have been recorded that talk a little bit more detail about each of the studies that we did. And with that, I want to close and just thank the workers. I want to thank the UFCW, the companies that allowed us to go in and collect this data, and the USDA for supporting the project. Also want to thank NIOSH for their support of our center. And like I said, we had close to 100 students, faculty, and staff who really sort of focused a lot of their time and energy over a 18-month to 2-year period to make this study happen. And so I want to say thank you to them as well. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. That was just so eye-opening, especially for us in at the Western Center, who we do have more of a focus a bit on crops and orchards and field ag. And so to see the animal production side and the clear hazards that those workers face is really important. So thank you so much. And yes, folks, please feel free to put questions into the chat. We're getting just feedback in general, just appreciating the presentation. I am curious if you could speak a little bit to the geography of where both this study took place, but also in general where poultry and swine processing happens, and then, sort of connecting that to the demographics of those workers.
Yeah, thanks. So we went again overall to 17 establishments in 9 different states. None of them were in California. Um, doesn't mean that there is not poultry processing here, but it just meant that the plants here didn't have waivers or weren't willing to have us there, one or the other. So we went everywhere from like Minnesota, Nebraska, down south and Mississippi, East Coast and Pennsylvania. I mean, so we really were sort of all over Middle America, northern states, southern states, a little bit on the eastern board. Um, and each of the plants had very different demographics depending on where they were and what their approach was to getting workers. We had some that had, more of an African American population. We had one that had workers from a local prison. We had others who, had a lot of their workers, were Hispanic and, so anyway, it just varied. And we had some that were immigrants from like other countries that had, come here from different African countries, et cetera, that were on exchange programs and such. So that we had a lot of pretty big diversity, but most were Hispanic.
Got it. Thank you. And then can you also speak to the range of other hazards that workers might have experienced, whether pathogen exposure, other kinds of hazards?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the risk of salmonella in the poultry plants. We heard from the workers that they got sick quite a bit in the beginning, and then they tended to not get sick over time. And so, whether that was from just sort of better best practices, or just they felt that they just kind of got used to the exposures. It's not really clear. We did have some industrial hygienists with us who were looking at everything from parasitic acid in poultry processing plants, and there were some big differences across the poultry establishments with parasitic acid exposures. I didn't have time to go over that, but that was one of the things that we looked at. And that could be just differences in like ventilation and fans and just sort of the layout, or having dip pans, for example, without a cover in some of their best practices. In swine, there was less parasitic acid, and so what were some of the things that we looked more at, like, carbon dioxide levels. We looked at, sort of just some basic there was less chemical exposure. There were less chemical exposures in the swine plants. So, but there are some nice summaries from our industrial hygienists on that COEH website as well. So if you're interested in the IH, and some of the chemical exposures, we didn't look at pathogens necessarily, but we did look at chemical exposures.
That's great. And we will send out links to some of those other webinars and publications because I know there's a lot of really good information. Another question, you looked at line speed and sort of the piece rate. Were there variation in hazard or those scores relative to the size of the plant?
No, it really made a difference on their staffing levels per line, right? And so we couldn't really look at the overall plant size because they all did things a little differently. Some had whole chickens, some had, like the N would be a little bit different. The cone lines are pretty similar. Live hang, chiller, rehang is pretty similar. And then after the cone lines, it gets a little bit varied after that. And so it really just mattered for each person sort of how their line was being staffed and how fast their line was moving, and less on the overall size of the plant or establishment. And so that's tricky, right? Because that's hard to manage and monitor. And even if there were some guardrails put in, it could be hard to enforce. But I think what we saw was that although obviously the establishments know that more people on the line reduces the overall workload, there doesn't seem to be sort of a methodical way to say, okay, but if you put in this much, many more people, it reduces the risk this much. And so, part of what we really think needs to happen is that these decisions on line speed and staffing need to be made with hazard in mind and quantitatively with hazard in mind, right? Whereas a lot of these jobs and the speeds and the staffing have just evolved over time. It's like what they've done for the last 30 years, and they just kind of tweak it through history and through knowing the jobs, but that doesn't really prevent any of the pain or injuries from happening. It just is sort of letting history repeat itself for decades on end.
Well, I want to thank you. I think that your work clearly has such important policy implications, and I hope that some of those are taken into account, if not through requirement, through best practices. And we know that it is possible to put into place good best practices, and hopefully some of the companies will take that knowledge that you have and share it. I want to just wrap by thanking everyone for joining us. I'd like to thank our interpreters who make this possible and remind everybody that our last seminar of the academic year is in June. Let's see. It's the first Monday of June. I don't have that number right in front of me, but we're going to be hearing from Jason Glaser from the La Isla Network talking about heat illness and illness reduction in Nicaragua. So please join us. And thank you again, Dr. Harris, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having
Bye.
me. Bye.